All right, so I know Brother James Pilgrim spoke last week. We weren't able to talk about 2 Samuel. Remember that 2 weeks ago where we left off in 2 Samuel chapter 6, this chapter had been all about how the Ark of the Covenant moves from the city of Kirjath-Jearim to Jerusalem. And it obviously was not an easy transition when we talk about what happened to Uzzah and how David angered God because of how he did not properly carry the Ark of the Covenant, as we saw, was instructed in the book of Leviticus. And so for a while the house stayed in the Ark of the Covenant stayed for a while in the house of more than likely a Philistine proselyte to Judaism, a Gittite. And God's anger had gone away. Obed-Edom, the man where the Ark of the Covenant, it was in his house where the Ark of the Covenant stayed for 3 months. He was blessed. And so David then continues the procession of the Ark to the city of Jerusalem. And things obviously didn't go very well for David. At least there was some opposition, again, of course, in the form of Saul's daughter Michal, who was upset about the way that David had presented himself before the people. Now, this chapter is also connected to chapter 7 because one of the things that we talked about in 2 Samuel chapter 6 is that whenever a capital city was established in basically these ancient times, typically whenever a new capital city was established, it would also become the religious center of worship for the people. This was not just something that affected Israel. This was something that affected all major nations at that time, whether that was Babylon, Persia, Rome. They all had a central worship location, typically within their capital city. And so David helps establish Jerusalem as the center of worship for Israel because, of course, the Ark of the Covenant is being moved to Jerusalem. Right? And what does the Ark of the Covenant represent to the people of Israel? God, right? The presence of God. So the Ark is moved towards to Jerusalem. And in chapter 7, it's actually connected with chapter 6 because another important thing that was necessary to establish a city as a religious center of worship is that there was a central building. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we don't read about the construction of that building, but we read about God detailing the plans, not through David, but through David's son Solomon, with how the temple would be built. And so these two chapters are sort of connected to one another. They go hand in hand because they both are trying to show how Jerusalem would become the center of worship for God's people because of the ark being there and because there's going to now be a permanent building where the sacrifices are made that we read about through the rest of the Old Testament and into the life of Jesus. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, I'm not exactly sure how far we'll get down to. I've got, I think, through verse 17 on the PowerPoint. We're not going to get that far, but we'll get as far as we can. But this opening to the chapter, there's a very good application that we can make for ourselves, looking especially at the first two verses. All right, so in 2 Samuel chapter 7, it says that it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. Now, one thing about a king's life is that it was very busy. If you serve as a leader in any capacity, that is a very time-consuming job, right? Because everything traces back to you, right? People have to report back to you. You have to deal with other issues that you have to manage because you are looked at as the leader of that particular group of people, whether that's in a group that you volunteer for, whether that's in a job. Being a leader is a very time-consuming job. We know that for Saul, it was a very time-consuming job. You remember we talked about how there's when we read throughout the book of 1 Samuel, it seems like there's always something going on. Whether that was for Saul, of course, a lot of that he brought on himself with his pursuit of David, but he still had to deal with and contend with other nations, because you're never fully secured. You always have to be prepared for a nation to invade, especially at this time. But in 2 Samuel 7, we're given sort of a rare glimpse into a king's life where he actually has time to sort of sit back and relax. Because in verse 1, the text simply tells us that the Lord had given David rest round about from all his enemies. Now, a lot of kings in this scenario would have sat back and thought about what all they could do with their spare time. Right? David no longer has to worry about these enemies that had been that had afflicted him, that had afflicted Saul. And for a lot of kings, they could have sat back and thought to themselves about, I've got a lot of spare time on my hands. Think about all the things that I can do with that spare time. Think about all the places that I could go visit. Think about all the buildings that I could construct in honor of me. Think about all the potential fun things that a king could do, that kings had the ability to do because of their vast wealth and their vast power. But David, notice that when he is given basically time off, so to speak, he's not thinking about how this time off can benefit himself. He's thinking about how this time off can benefit God. Because he looks, verse 2, again, that he tells, again, Nathan, see now I dwell in a house of cedar, which you remember we talked about in 2 Samuel chapter 5. When David conquered Jerusalem, he built it up. He built it up the way that he wanted to. He had all those really very expensive Lebanon cedar trees imported because of the relationship that he had with the king of Tyre. And he had a very nice house, but by the time that he's given rest from his enemies, he notices that he lives in a very nice house, but God, on the other hand, dwells in curtains. Which that's a reference to what? The tabernacle, right? Now you think about a tabernacle, we think about it being a tent that's moved around a lot. If you think about a tent, and I've never been camping enough to be able to say this, but if you use a tent for a long period of time, and keep in mind that this tent had been being used from this tent had been used since they had been wandering in the wilderness up to this point. And you think about over time how much wear and tear there could be on that tent. It may not look nearly as good as it once did. And so David looks at his very nice permanent house and looks at where the Ark of the Covenant resides and notices that, at least in his mind, that God dwells in a very lackluster situation than he did. And so David's going to be of the mind that, if I dwell in this very nice house, what does that mean for God? Shouldn't God also dwell in a much nicer house than I do? And credit David, and we'll point out that God he doesn't contradict, he doesn't rebuke David, but he brings out a point, as we'll see in 2 Samuel 7, verse 7. But you got to give credit to David here because he thinks about what he does with his, because of what he wants to do with his spare time. Now, let's think about this from our perspective. I know most of you in here are older and probably have retired from work. And I know whenever you're working in life, you think about all the great things that you'll be able to do when you retire, right? You don't have to spend as much time at work anymore. You don't have to spend any time, perhaps, at work anymore. You save up your money to be able to do fun things when you retire, whether that's go on trips to really places maybe you've never been. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saving up and being able to enjoy those things after you retire. But there are a lot of people that when they retire, they think about all the things that they can do for themselves, but That mindset never translates to recognizing, now I have more opportunities to do things for the church. Or now I have more opportunities to help out with the work of the church. And we can never get into that mindset because when you think about what God has blessed us with, we're supposed to use that to help out with the work of the church. And there are a lot of people that have taken that mindset whenever they've gotten to the point of retiring, that they've never translated all that free time and energy, not all of it, because again, you do spend time taking fun trips and doing things that you like, but sometimes when people retire, they never take that energy, at least part of it, and translate it into recognizing that, I have more opportunities to help out with the work of the church. And that's a mindset that we never want to get into. Now, I think about that for myself because there are times whenever being a teacher, where I have time off. And this is something that I have to remind myself of, a particular mindset that, I like to enjoy my time off from not teaching school, but at the same time, I have more opportunity to devote to studying, or I have more opportunity to participate, to go to different events like gospel meetings and things like that, to try to help encourage other Christians. And I remind myself of that. This is a point that we all have to remind ourselves of. And David shows us a very good mindset to have whenever we do have time off, whether that's time off from work or whether that's time off from retirement. How much of that time off do we think about spending that energy and that time to try to help out, to more so try to help out with the work of the church? Because when David had time off, his first thought was, how can God be benefited with his time off? And so David is going to come up with the idea, again, that he wants to build God a new house. Notice verse 3 that Nathan, of course, hears this. Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee." Now, of course, what this did not mean is that Nathan's saying here that, David, if you want to go build God a house, go build God a house. It's not necessarily what Nathan's saying here, but in a sense, Nathan is, of course, approving of is in approval of what David's intention is, right? Because David wants to benefit God with his time off. But verse 4, notice that it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shalt thou build me a house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent, in a tabernacle. And in all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why do you not build me a house of cedar?" So that very night when David has told Nathan his plans, God talks to Nathan again, Nathan being a prophet of God, in communication with God. And God's message here is something that we need to think about. He says again, "Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, Shall you build me a house for me to dwell in?" David, that's what your intention is. Think about this, verses 6 through 7. Think about all the time that the children of Israel wandered in the land of Egypt. That's what he's getting at, verse 6. Right? While they were wandering in Egypt, I didn't dwell in a house. And the idea here is a permanent building, right? I have not dwelled in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. God says, I've never had this, I've not had this permanent structure, so to speak, since this time. Verse 7, "In all the places wherein I have walked with all the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why do you not build me a house of cedar?" So in all this time, God has never commanded his people to set aside time, to set aside resources to building him a permanent house. Now, we understand that in part because the children of Israel had always been on the move since, or at least until they got to the land of Canaan. So it makes sense then why there's not a permanent house built for God. But even while the children of Israel, since the time of Joshua, have been in the land of Canaan up to the time of David, God had never commanded them to build him a permanent house. Now, what God is doing, what God is reminding David here, and this is not so much a rebuke, but it is a reminder that God puts in place, and that's that God's not necessarily concerned about the lavishness of where he lives. And when you read this, you want to keep in mind, and I was reading through this, another source really brought up a good point here. But we know that one of the chief gods of the Canaanites was the god Baal. And if you go back and you read some of the stories about Baal, there are several things. There are several themes that come out with that study of that particular god. But one of the themes that comes out is that the Canaanite god Baal was always wanting a bigger and better house for himself. If you go back and you read the ancient texts that were connected to the Canaanite people and to the god Baal, in those stories over and over again, you read about how Baal wanted his people to continue to build him a bigger and better house. And what God is pointing at here in verse 7, he's not rebuking David's mindset, but he's basically telling David, it doesn't matter how lavish my house is. David's concerned about how lavish his house is compared to God, but God's telling David, if I'm really concerned about building this lavish house, I would have told my people to do that earlier. That's why I never told them, why do you not build me a house of cedar? And that's the importance there, verse 7, or at least the phrase house of cedar, would denote a very lavish type of house, because cedar trees were very expensive. And that's the point that God is bringing out. He's not so much concerned about the lavishness of his household, more so than he would have been concerned with the holiness of his people. And that's something that we need to take in mind as Christians. When we think about, and in this particular case, we can connect that to thinking about the church building. You know, there are a lot of people, and I've heard of a lot of congregations, we're not talking about, congregations of the Lord's church per se. We're also talking about other denominations here. But you think about how over time there have been a lot of denominations and maybe even churches of Christ that have spent so much money on making their building look really great. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but sometimes, we can go overboard. And I'm not saying us here, but I know that there are some denominational groups and maybe other churches of Christ that have gone overboard in trying to make their building look as nice as it can be. But when they're doing that, they're also not concerned about the cleanliness, we could say, the spiritual cleanliness of the congregation inside. And there are a lot of congregations, and there are a lot of denominational churches, and I'll bring this up because Dad brought it up. You think about the lavishness of some of those churches in Europe that those churches have stood for centuries, and you'll find very few people in them on Sundays, even though the building on the outside is really nice. And the point being is that when those churches were being built, they were built with the intent of making them as lavish as possible, but the lavishness or the expensive nature of those churches didn't keep people in the building, which is a very sad thing. But it's a point that I think we can remind ourselves of, that God is pointing out to David. You want to build me a lavish house? That's great. But, if I was so concerned about a lavish house, I would have told the people of Israel to do that when we first got into Canaan. Because God's importance, and we know this to be true, that God's importance is not on the lavishness of a building, but on the spiritual condition of His people. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about, verses 1 through 7?
We just place the emphasis on what we see so much.
Right.
The emphasis on the external, but we fail to see what often really more important, and that's the end. That's always been a problem.
Right.
Another thing too, Adam, he's pointing out to David, you go to a house of cedar, it's time you put me first.
Right.
To me, that's what I get out of that is we build ourselves up when really he tells us that he's first.
Right.
Take care of his house first, and then worry about your house.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And to David's credit, he now recognizes that too. Very good thoughts. All right, verse 8. Now therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following the people, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies, also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee a house. And so here, God tells Nathan to recount, or not to, basically to retell to David again, remember how your position came about. Think about how you became king. All right, and he reminds him, again, Nathan is told by God to remind David that it was God who went, found him tending to sheep, called him to be the ruler over his people. All the situations that we read about in the book of 1 Samuel that David found himself in, we read about a consistent phrase that God was with him. And God reminds him of that here in verse 9. And so by this point, David, of course, has a great name. He has a great name within Israel. He's the king, but also, as we talked about with the alliance that he established with the king of Tyre, he has a great name. He has a great name among them as well. And of course, when we get to the New Testament, David is remembered, probably more so than any other king in Israel's history, because of his great name. Now, I want us to turn back for a moment to Genesis chapter 12. Because what God is going to discuss with David here through the prophet Nathan is a reference back to the promises that God had made to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we remember these as the three great promises that God made to Abraham. And the text reads, Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now we know, of course, that over the course of time, the people of Israel have grown into a very mighty nation. And one thing that we note about the reign of King David is this is perhaps the pinnacle of Israel's power. Israel would never be more powerful than it was under the reign of King David. But of course we know that the biggest promise that comes here is not that the people of Israel would grow, that they would have a great name. But, of course, verse 3, that in or through the people of Israel, all families of the earth would be blessed. And that's what David is going to be reminded of in 2 Samuel chapter 7. This promise is going to be renewed, so to speak, because of God mentioning this to David through the prophet Nathan. So when we go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is those three promises are important to keep in mind when you read about what God promises the king of David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So again, that's what's again that's what's that is what is given in verse 10. Again, moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. Now, of course, we know that later on that the physical nation of Israel would be moved. At least when we talk about what happens when the temple is destroyed and the Roman armies come in towards the end of the first century. And part of what we begin to talk about here is this is what's called a dual prophecy. It is a prophecy that's going to be connected to both, it's going to connect both to the coming of the kingdom, but it's also connected to David's son Solomon. And this is a promise that is referenced also in Psalm chapter 89. So, verse 12, God tells David, "And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." All right, in verse 12, who is God referencing here? Solomon, right? "I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom." Remember, we've already talked about the genealogy of David, or the descendants of David. And we've already talked about Solomon being one of those descendants. At least at this time, he's not born yet. That'll come in the future, but it's going to be him, verse 13, "He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Now, of course, we know that Solomon would not reign forever. We know that the position, the physical position of the king of Israel would not reign forever. When we get to the first century, we don't read about a king in Israel anymore. And the point being is that God is not also just referencing Solomon here, but he's also describing a future descendant of David. That would be who?
Jesus.
Jesus, right? "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And this particular kingdom being talked about is what? The church, right? "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Unlike the children of Israel who could be moved, like the physical nation, when God talked about his kingdom in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews said that we have received a kingdom which cannot be what? Cannot be moved. That's the idea that it is established forever. When Jesus made the promise to the apostles in Matthew chapter 16 that he would build his church, what could not overcome the church? Yeah, the gates of hell. There's nothing that could overcome it. The idea is that this would be a permanent kingdom. And so while God is talking about Solomon here in terms of building a house for his name, he would certainly do that. He's also talking about Jesus at the same time, because it would be the throne of Jesus that is established forever. Verse 14, "I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee, before thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David." Now, of course, we know verse 14, with the case of Jesus, Jesus is a man that did know iniquity. Right? 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about that. But then verse 15, my mercy shall not depart away from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. At no point in time did God ever reject Jesus as being the king, the head of the church. That's a point that was true then. It's a point that's still true today. Unlike Saul, for instance, God had rejected him as the king over Israel. That's why he sought out David to replace him. But Jesus, on the other hand, would never be replaced as king over his church. And that's a very good reminder for us. I know we talked about Diotrephes in 3 John on Wednesday night. Diotrephes is a character that tried to basically replace Jesus as the head of the church where he was at. And for that, John rebuked him for that. But unlike Saul, Jesus as king over his church is a king that is perfect and that cannot be replaced. And so that verse 16, his house and his kingdom is established forever. Thy throne shall be established forever. All right, with that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to verses 14 through, or what we talked about up through verse 17?
This is a crucial passage, especially in light of the teaching today of so many that, the kingdom hasn't come yet.
Right.
And the belief that it's going to be earthly, physical, and they interpret that as, again, a fulfillment of this passage, at least in part, because it'll be on earth, they say, and that'll be the renewal of the kingdom, and Christ will rule for 1,000 years. But again, that's focusing on the external and not the internal, and missing the point entirely of the nature of the church.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't read anything in there about there needing to be a second attempt to build a kingdom. Because I know some that hold to that idea that there's a coming kingdom that Christ will reign over for 1,000 years. There's some people that hold to the idea that Christ attempted to do that while he was on earth and it didn't work. Well, you don't read about that anywhere here, Brother George.
The Apostle Paul told us in Corinthian letter that when he comes back, he's coming back for the church.
Right.
He'll carry the church then into eternity, so it will be established forever.
Mm-hmm.
It will never fade away.
Right. It's like it reminds us of that point reminds us of when you think about the rich man and Lazarus, how there was a great gulf that separated the righteous from the wicked. That also we think about that great gulf, we think about the rich man not being able to enter into the bosom of Abraham. But the opposite side of that is also true. If there's a great gulf that separates the righteous from the wicked, we don't have to worry about going to the place where the rich man resides once we've died and we're found faithful before God. That's a very good point. The throne's established forever. The promise is the goodness of being in that kingdom. We don't have to worry about that ever slipping away as long as we remain faithful to God. If there are no other comments, we're going to go ahead and stop here because that's a good natural stopping point. We'll pick up in verse 18 next week, and we'll get down through the rest of the chapter. But thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.